In the dark forests of Normandy, 1944, a group of battle-hardened German tank commanders stood in stunned silence. What they saw wasn't one or two, but dozens of American Sherman tanks rolling toward them like a steel tide. The Wehrmacht had faced British Churchills, Soviet T-34s, and their own mighty Tigers, but nothing had prepared them for this. The Germans weren't just shocked by the tank itself, they were shocked by how many there were. It was as if the Americans had an endless supply, and in many ways, they did. Welcome back to the channel, history fans. Today, we're diving into one of the most fascinating revelations of World War II, the moment when German soldiers and commanders realized that America's secret weapon wasn't just the M4 Sherman tank itself. It was the sheer, overwhelming number of them. To understand this shock, we have to roll back the clock to 1942 and 1943, when the United States was still ramping up for total war. Germany had been at war since 1939, building up its feared Panzer divisions, producing machines like the Panzer IV, the Panther, and eventually the Tiger. These tanks were technologically superior, better guns, thicker armor, and in one-on-one combat they could easily destroy a Sherman from over a mile away. But as German commanders would soon discover, the Americans weren't planning to fight fair. Let's set the scene. Europe was burning. Germany was deep into Russia, fighting the Soviets at Stalingrad and Kursk, while the Western Allies were preparing for a return to the continent. American industry was awakening like a sleeping giant, something Japanese Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto famously feared after Pearl Harbor. And when that giant woke up, it built tanks. A lot of them. By late 1943, American factories were turning out thousands of Shermans every single month. Detroit became known as the arsenal of democracy. Factories that once built cars were now spitting out tanks, aircraft, and weapons at a rate the Axis simply couldn't match. For every Panther that Germany built, America produced multiple Shermans. German soldiers on the front lines first started encountering Shermans in North Africa. Rommel's Afrika Korps initially underestimated them, calling them inferior to their own panzers. But something caught their attention. No matter how many they knocked out, more kept coming. A German officer wrote in his diary after the Battle of El Alamein, "The Tommies and Yankees seem to have an endless supply of these machines. Each time we destroy one, another appears. It is like fighting the sea." That sense of dread would only grow worse as the war dragged on. When the Allies landed in Sicily and Italy in 1943, the Germans saw even larger concentrations of Shermans. But the real shock would come in June 1944, during Operation Overlord, D-Day, and the Battle of Normandy. When the dust settled, the Germans discovered that the Allies had landed over 15,000 armored vehicles in just the first weeks of the campaign. For many German tank crews, this was their first real taste of what it meant to face an opponent with nearly unlimited resources. Imagine being a German Panther commander. Your tank is powerful, yes, you can knock out Shermans at 2,500 meters. But then 5 more Shermans roll into view. You destroy 1, 2, maybe even 3. But by the time you reload, there are still more closing in. And soon they've flanked you. This was the nightmare that German crews started to experience across France. The M4 Sherman may not have been the best tank of the war, far from it, but its availability in staggering numbers made it one of the most decisive. And this is where the story really begins, how America's industrial power turned the tide of armored warfare, and how it left German soldiers completely stunned. Over the next several parts, we're going to explore how the Sherman tank became the backbone of the Allied advance, why the Germans were so shocked by the numbers they faced, and how this massive production ultimately crushed the Wehrmacht's ability to fight back. So buckle up, because this isn't just a story about tanks. It's a story about numbers, about logistics, and about how sheer quantity can overwhelm even the most fearsome quality. Before German soldiers could be shocked by the sheer flood of Shermans rolling across Europe, there was a quiet, almost invisible buildup happening an ocean away, inside America's factories. The story of the Sherman's overwhelming numbers begins not on the battlefield, but on the factory floor. When the United States entered World War II after Pearl Harbor, it faced a daunting challenge. Build an army big enough to fight a two-front war across two oceans and keep it supplied. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called for what he termed the arsenal of democracy. In his famous December 1940 speech, he told the nation that America must become the great supplier of weapons for those fighting tyranny. And when the U.S. entered the war in December 1941, that vision became a massive industrial mobilization unlike anything the world had ever seen. Car factories in Detroit stopped making sedans and began producing tanks. Ford's massive Willow Run plant, designed by the legendary engineer Charles Sorensen, became the largest factory under one roof in the world. At its peak, Willow Run was producing one B-24 bomber every 63 minutes, and similar production lines were building thousands of tanks. The M4 Sherman was designed to be reliable, easy to mass produce, and simple for crews to maintain in the field. Unlike the complex German Tiger or Panther tanks, the Sherman could be built quickly, with interchangeable parts, using existing American automotive expertise. This meant that when one was knocked out, its replacement could be shipped overseas in weeks, not months. By late 1942, thousands of Shermans were already arriving in North Africa, equipping American forces under General Dwight D. Eisenhower and British forces under Montgomery. At battles like El Alamein, Kasserine Pass, and Tunis, German forces noticed that the Americans didn't just have one armored division, they had several, all well-equipped. German intelligence began filing reports back to Berlin, noting the alarming rate of Allied production. The Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, OKW, the German High Command, realized that they were in an industrial race they might not be able to win. Speer, Hitler's armaments minister, pushed for more tank production, but Germany simply didn't have the raw materials, fuel, or safe factories to match the American output. Allied bombing campaigns were already crippling German industry, while American factories were running 24 hours a day, untouched by enemy attack. For the Germans on the ground, however, this was still a slow realization. In 1942 and 1943, they still believed they could outfight the Allies with superior tactics and better tanks. And to be fair, the Panzer IV, and later the Panther, were formidable machines. A Panther's high-velocity 75mm gun could pierce a Sherman's armor frontally from long distances, while the Sherman often needed to close the gap dangerously to knock out a Panther. But here's where the math started to turn against Germany. In 1943 alone, American factories produced over 17,000 Shermans. By contrast, Germany produced fewer than 2,000 Panthers that same year. This wasn't just a difference in numbers, it was a difference in philosophy. The Germans focused on quality, designing powerful advanced tanks but ones that were slow to produce and mechanically temperamental. The Americans, by contrast, focused on quantity and reliability. They knew they didn't need a perfect tank. They just needed enough good ones to keep advancing. When the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, German commanders began to see what that meant. The Americans could lose dozens of tanks in a single engagement and still keep pushing forward. For the Germans, every lost Panther or Tiger was a significant blow. A German panzer commander later recalled, "We could knock out their tanks, yes, but they kept coming. It was as though each one we destroyed was instantly replaced." As the Allies advanced through Italy in late 1943 and early 1944, the Germans began preparing for what they knew was coming next: a full-scale Allied invasion of France. Hitler poured resources into building the Atlantic Wall, confident that even if the Allies landed, they would be thrown back into the sea. But what the German soldiers didn't know, what they couldn't fully comprehend, was just how many Shermans were already waiting in Britain, ready to roll the moment the invasion began. The stage was set. The sleeping giant of American industry was now wide awake, and its steel beasts were gathering like a storm on the horizon. It was the morning of June 6, 1944, D-Day. As German defenders peered out over the beaches of Normandy, they expected an invasion, but not like this. The German soldiers manning the bunkers of the Atlantic Wall knew the Allies would come. What they did not know was the scale. Thousands of ships, tens of thousands of vehicles, and an army that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Among the waves of landing craft were the first Sherman tanks, specially modified for the assault. Some were amphibious DD Shermans, equipped with canvas screens and propellers to swim ashore. For many German troops, this was their first encounter with the Sherman en masse, and it was terrifying. Even though many of the swimming tanks sank in the rough seas, enough made it to shore to give the infantry crucial armored support. Within hours, the Allies had a foothold, and with each passing day, more and more Shermans were rolling off the landing ships. In the days after D-Day, the hedgerows of Normandy became a nightmare battlefield. German Panther and Tiger tanks prowled the countryside, ambushing Shermans from concealed positions. The Sherman crews paid a heavy price. Tank after tank was knocked out by the deadly 80mm guns of the Tigers or the high-velocity rounds of the Panthers. But here is where the Germans started to feel something they hadn't felt before: a creeping sense of being overwhelmed. No matter how many Shermans they destroyed, more appeared the next morning. The Americans would simply salvage what they could, replace their losses, and attack again. It was a relentless cycle. We destroyed a dozen of their tanks, but by evening, they attacked again with more. It was as though we were trying to hold back a river with our bare hands. German tank aces like Michael Wittmann, the legendary Tiger commander, could wipe out entire columns of Shermans in a single battle. But even Wittmann admitted that the numbers kept coming, and eventually even the best tank crews could not stop the tide. This is where the German shock really set in. Their tactical victories no longer mattered. A Panther ambush might kill 10 Shermans, but by the next day, 15 more would roll up. The Allies had cracked the code of modern warfare: win by sustaining the fight longer than the enemy can. The Sherman was perfectly suited for this war of attrition. It was easy to fix. Its engines were reliable. Crews could learn to drive and fight in them after only a few weeks of training. Most importantly, America could build them faster than Germany could destroy them. The contrast became painfully obvious in July 1944 during Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. The Americans unleashed a massive carpet bombing campaign, blasting a hole in the German lines. Then the Sherman divisions rolled through, hundreds of them, spreading out across the French countryside like an unstoppable wave. Panzer Lehr Division, one of Germany's elite armored formations, was virtually annihilated trying to stop this onslaught. German survivors reported that they had never seen so many tanks in one place at one time. One officer's after-action report read, "Our division is no longer combat effective. Enemy material superiority is absolute. Their tanks are everywhere." This was the moment German soldiers began to whisper about America's war machine in awe and fear. It wasn't that the Sherman was unbeatable. It wasn't that it was better. It was simply that there were too many of them, arriving too quickly, and supported by endless fuel, ammunition, and artillery. For the first time, many German troops felt something dangerous, that the war might truly be unwinnable. But the shock would deepen even further in the weeks ahead, when the Americans proved they could not only replace their losses, but actually increase their numbers as they advanced. By late summer 1944, the German shock had turned into something darker, a grim realization that they were running out of time, men and machines. After the breakout from Normandy, the Allied advance across France was breathtaking. American armored divisions, spearheaded by Sherman tanks, were moving faster than even Eisenhower had expected. German commanders tried to regroup at places like Falaise, but the so-called Falaise pocket turned into a slaughter. Shermans and Allied fighter bombers tore through retreating German columns, leaving the roads choked with wrecked panzers, trucks, and artillery. This was a turning point. The Germans no longer saw the Sherman as just another Allied tank. They saw it as a symbol of American power. The sheer logistical machine behind those tanks was crushing them. Let's pause here and put some numbers on this, because this is where the shock really deepened. By the end of summer 1944, America had already produced over 30,000 Sherman tanks. These weren't sitting idle. They were pouring into Europe in waves, joining Patton's Third Army as it thundered across France toward the German border. German soldiers noticed something disturbing. When they destroyed an American tank column, it didn't seem to slow the Allied advance. Within days, new tanks, new trucks, and fresh fuel were back in place, and the offensive continued. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt reportedly told Hitler after the Falaise disaster, "We are facing an enemy who can replace his losses faster than we can inflict them. This is a war of material and we cannot win it." The psychological effect on German troops was profound. Before, they had taken pride in their superior equipment, the Tiger, the Panther, the fearsome 88mm gun. They believed these technological advantages could hold off the Allies indefinitely. But now, even with these powerful weapons, they were being pushed back day after day. Sherman crews, meanwhile, were adapting. After suffering heavy losses in Normandy's hedgerows, the Americans modified their tanks with improvised armor, sandbags, spare track links, even logs, to give them a fighting chance against German guns. They introduced new variants like the Sherman Firefly, a British modification with a deadly 17-pounder gun that could finally take on a Panther or Tiger at long range. German crews were shocked the first time they saw a Tiger destroyed head-on by what they thought was a normal Sherman. Their psychological edge was eroding. The turning point came as the Allies reached the Siegfried Line, Germany's fortified western border. This was supposed to be a nearly impenetrable wall of bunkers, dragon's teeth, and obstacles. But even here, the Shermans kept coming. American engineers cleared the defenses and wave after wave of armored columns poured through. German units were burning out. Panthers and Tigers were breaking down from overuse. There was no fuel to keep them moving, and no replacements coming fast enough from the factories which were being pounded day and night by Allied bombers. One German tank officer described it in a letter, "Our machines are few. They are magnificent weapons, but they are all we have left. The enemy's tanks, though inferior, are endless. It is like being crushed by a giant hammer, again and again, without rest." By late 1944, the Wehrmacht was fighting with its back against the wall. Morale was collapsing. Even Hitler's last gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, or Battle of the Bulge, could not reverse the tide. In that winter offensive, the Germans managed to surprise the Allies and temporarily halt their advance. But once again, when American tank losses mounted, the replacements arrived within weeks. The Germans, meanwhile, could not replace their own losses. By January 1945, their armored strength had been bled dry. But the story of the Sherman's overwhelming numbers wasn't finished yet, because as the Allies crossed the Rhine and entered Germany itself, German soldiers would see something that truly broke their spirit: columns of fresh tanks rolling in while their own forces had virtually nothing left to fight with. By March 1945, the nightmare was complete. The German army, once feared across Europe, was in full retreat. And leading the charge, mile after mile, town after town, were Sherman tanks. The climax of this story came as the Allies crossed the Rhine River. This was Hitler's last natural defensive barrier. The German High Command believed that if they could hold the Allies here, they might buy time to negotiate peace in the West. But the Americans had other plans, and more importantly, they had the tanks to make those plans happen. At Remagen, American forces captured the Ludendorff Bridge intact, an incredible stroke of luck. Within hours, Sherman tanks were rumbling across, creating a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the Rhine. German commanders were horrified. They had expected to demolish the bridge and stall the Americans for weeks. Instead, they watched as more and more Shermans crossed over, building up overwhelming strength on the far side. From this moment, the Allied advance turned into a relentless flood. Patton's Third Army raced across Germany at a pace that stunned even his own staff. His armored columns, often dozens of miles long, smashed through German defenses before they could reform. German soldiers who surrendered often spoke with awe about the number of tanks they faced. One captured officer reportedly told his American interrogators, "We never feared the Sherman itself. We feared the fact that every time we destroyed one, there were always 5 more." The impact on German morale was devastating. Entire units began to collapse not because they were defeated in combat, but because they were simply exhausted, mentally and physically, from fighting an enemy that never seemed to run out of men or machines. As the Allies closed in on the Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of Germany, the final blow fell. Hundreds of thousands of German troops were encircled in what became known as the Ruhr Pocket. Sherman tanks spearheaded the attack, crushing resistance and forcing one of the largest mass surrenders of the war on the Western Front. For the Germans, the realization was now absolute. They could not win. Their vaunted Tigers and Panthers, once the kings of the battlefield, were now little more than expensive targets. Many were abandoned by their crews simply because there was no fuel to run them. The resolution of this story came not with a single dramatic tank battle, but with the quiet, unstoppable advance of Allied armor across the Reich. By April 1945, Sherman tanks were rolling into every major German city: Cologne, Frankfurt, Nuremberg, symbols of a war machine that had achieved the impossible. In the final weeks, some German units simply surrendered at the sight of an approaching armored column. There was no point in resisting. They knew the Allies had more tanks behind the first wave, and more after that, stretching back all the way to the ports of Antwerp and Cherbourg, and ultimately across the Atlantic to Detroit. When the shooting finally stopped in May 1945, over 49,000 Shermans had been built. They had fought in every theater, on every front. And though thousands had been destroyed, thousands more were still rolling forward when the war ended. The Germans had been shocked, then awed and finally crushed, not by a tank superior to their own, but by an idea that their war machine could never match: total, relentless production. But this story doesn't need to end with the German surrender, because the legacy of the Sherman tank and the lessons the world learned from its numbers would go on to shape the next era of warfare. When the dust of war finally settled over Europe, the world took a deep breath, and when historians looked back, one thing was clear: America's overwhelming production of Sherman tanks had been one of the decisive factors in the defeat of Nazi Germany. The German shock wasn't just a wartime phenomenon, it became a subject of study for decades after 1945. Military analysts, generals, and historians all asked the same question: how did an army fielding tanks that were, on paper, weaker than the enemy's manage to sweep across Europe so successfully? Germany had produced some of the best tanks of the war, technologically advanced, heavily armed, and heavily armored, but they built too few of them too slowly, and without the industrial base to keep them fueled and repaired. The Americans, by contrast, built a tank that was good enough, and then produced it in such numbers that it didn't matter if one was knocked out. There was always another waiting to take its place. Here's the surprising twist: even after the war, many nations around the world continued to use the Sherman for decades. They fought in Korea, in the Middle East, and even appeared in conflicts as late as the 1970s. The tank that German soldiers once mocked as inferior outlived the mighty Tiger, which was too expensive and complicated for post-war armies to maintain. And perhaps the most ironic fact of all? After the war, some captured German panzer commanders admitted they envied the Americans. They admired the Sherman not for its power, but for its reliability and simplicity. It was the tank that just kept coming, and in war, that was what truly mattered. The story of the Sherman isn't just about steel and numbers. It's about what happens when a nation turns its full industrial might toward a single goal. The Germans were shocked not because the Sherman was invincible, but because it was unstoppable. And that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. Wars are not always won by the best technology. They are won by the side that can keep fighting the longest. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the story of the Sherman tank and the shock it caused among German soldiers, make sure to give this video a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next World War II story. We've got more incredible tales of strategy, survival, and surprise coming your way.